So hi everyone, I'm just going to run through an overview of some of the findings of the STEP study. I'm Charlotte Absi, but all aspects of the study, just to be clear, including the initial funding application, have been co-led with a team of early career researchers, young person co-researchers and an LGBT+ organisation representative. And obviously thanks also to the Triumph team for their funding and for their support throughout the project. So school is clearly important when thinking about prevention and early intervention in mental health. And for sexual and gender minority students, hostile or unsupportive school environments are detrimental to mental health as well as academic outcomes. So providing school staff with knowledge, skills, understanding, and the capacity to create environments that are welcoming and supportive is obviously important anyway for a multitude of reasons, but is also potentially beneficial in helping address the disproportionate mental health difficulties experienced by these communities. And there's some evidence that training positively impacts staff attitudes and behaviours towards sexual and gender minority students, but studies haven't really examined their impact on student experience or outcomes, or on their sort of underpinning mechanisms of change of that training. And in general, unfortunately, schools-based LGBTQ+ research is often US-based and focuses on white and cisgender students, hindering generalizability to different contexts, but also disregarding other aspects of people's identities and their social positions, which add nuance and complexity to people's lived experience. And very much a lot of research, particularly in the public mental health sphere, is sort of within that deficit approach. So we wanted to understand what training is already available about sexual orientation and gender identity for secondary schools and colleges, and to compare this with what students and staff said was important. But also, when I first started talking to existing training providers out there, there was a common theme was, well, the training is out there, the knowledge is available, but there are barriers to taking it up and implementing it. So we also wanted to understand more about what those were, how they related to each other, and how they differed across different contexts as well, so ultimately to try and identify ways to enhance uptake. In terms of approach, we felt really strongly that this research should take an intersectional perspective, focusing here on intersections with race, ethnicity, religion, faith, and also to contrast the experiences of people in urban and rural and coastal areas to think about the sort of the influence of context. Clearly acknowledging positionality here is very important. So as a co-production team as a whole, we included people from different age, gender, racial and ethnic groups and faith backgrounds. And we found that reflecting on our different perspectives as well as those potentially missing from the team has been really important throughout. So we carried out interviews and focus groups and some workshops with 63 people totally. And that included training providers, secondary school and college staff, both teaching and non-teaching, and students as well. So just in brief then, we found an overall theme which underpinned the approaches that were identified as important to creating supportive and welcoming environments for LGBTQ+ students, which was that they operate across the whole school, they're intersectional, and they serve to shift the narrative. So whole school here refers to the fact that people talked about approaches within curriculum teaching, within the wider school ethos and environment, as well as engaging across the staff and student body with families and community partners. Being intersectional, as I said, meant for them to be meaningful and relevant, these practices should be responsive and considerate of other aspects of young people's identities. And actually, we found that this intersectional angle was something that was missing from a lot of the training providers' existing training. And shifting the narrative referred to the underlying sense of the need to challenge prevailing deficit perspectives and to reflect on the impact of white, Western, cisgender and heterosexist norms within educational organisations and the structures beyond that. So in other words, while we started out thinking about professional development training needs, what people consistently talked about were more fundamental and contextually contingent changes to school structure and culture. So these overarching principles or pillars, if you like, applied to a further 4 interrelated themes, which I've listed there. And also we identified several multi-level, so staff, organisational and socio-political factors, which acted to hinder change within schools, which I'll touch on briefly a bit more now. So the first thing, feeling safe, seen and celebrated, embedding signs, signals and symbols for visibility. So here participants discussed the importance of visual cues and representation within the physical environment, within curricula, and the staff body, which represent, make visible and celebrate LGBTQ+ identities. And importantly, for this to include intersecting identities and statuses. And by celebrating these sort of different identities, such visibility was also perceived to help shift the narrative, mainly by disconfirming sort of prevailing norms and power relations. So the second theme was everyone's business, collaborative working and partnerships. And this really highlights the importance of stakeholders right across the school system. So including different staff groups, senior leadership, governors, students, parents, and the wider community, all working together collaboratively, supportively, and proactively to raise awareness and understanding about how the school environment matters and how to change it for the benefit of sexual and gender minority students, for those who are not out or are questioning, as well as students just wanting to know more about sexual and gender identity. So third theme, embedding a culture of change. So this highlighted the importance of sustained and consistent actions, which could help actively unpick these norms that were ingrained within the school system. So for example, this included things like having a consistency of visibility and representation, not just during Pride Month, having a consistent response to homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying, embedding training and opportunities for staff reflection continuously rather than as just kind of one-off tick box exercises, and also things like including specific references to gender and sexual orientation within existing school policies and teacher training as well. So the last of these four themes talked about the need, again, to move away from the idea that LGBTQ+ young persons and topics are a problem. So this kind of deficit thinking that means that minority sexual orientations, being trans or gender non-conforming, are a kind of, sort of vulnerability that needs addressing, or it's a challenge that needs to be overcome, or even inherently poses a risk to the young person, as some staff seem to think. And this deficit thinking, importantly, also really precludes recognition of the many ways in which young people act to challenge and resist exclusionary norms and behaviours. It reflects a lack of emphasis on the positive experiences of coming out, being part of activist work, positive examples of familial and school and peer support, and also of just being proud of who they are. And lastly, the relocating the problem theme also related to a common feeling that there's a need to stop relying on gender and sexual minority students and staff to educate others and to provide support. So just to move on to the final part now, which is really, about why doesn't this happen? People we spoke to discussed individual, organisational and wider social barriers to taking up and implementing not just professional development training, as I said, but also those wider school changes. And there were clear links and interdependencies between them. This diagram was really a very early attempt to visualise these, which you won't be able to read probably, but hopefully hints at some of the complexities and nuance involved. So just to touch on a few things, staff level belief barriers ranged from sort of overtly homophobic, biphobic, transphobic attitudes or opinions, to discomfort about discussing or engaging with sexual and gender diversity, or really just being quite apathetic or ambivalent about it. It's never been an issue before, why is it suddenly an issue now? And for many staff members, including those identifying as LGBTQ+, there was often a sense of confusion, lack of confidence and fear. So for example, not recognising or not knowing how to respond to bullying, not feeling equipped with the language and the skills to teach about or to discuss queer identities, or how to manage conversations around religion and gender identity and sexual orientation. And there was also uncertainty about being out themselves as a staff member. And another common and I think quite powerful source of fear was about backlash from parents, which could potentially damage staff and or organisational reputations. And this was really exacerbated by a lack of confidence in how to engage with them about this, or how to respond to complaints and concerns, particularly if they were high profile. Just briefly then onto the organisational barriers. So that included things, unsurprisingly, like a lack of buy-in and support from leadership and management teams, lack of time, capacity and funding, not seeing it as much of a priority as attainment and achievement, and also, again, sort of worries about the school's reputation. And then finally, local and political contexts were really influential. So lack of support and clear government guidance, anti-trans group lobbying, fears about legal action, ill-informed wider societal discourse, pressures from parent groups and so on. And all of these things interacted with the organisational level factors, such as buy-in and prioritisation. So that was definitely a broad brush overview of the findings, but we think that more research really is needed to examine the influence of such approaches on student outcomes, to capture parent and community perspectives, to be driven from those lenses, and also to develop evidence-based implementation strategies to support uptake and adoption of inclusive practices. Thank you.